Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Future Tech podcast series. It's me, Charlie Sell, the MD for Arrows Group, and this is our chance to speak with thought leaders, people involved in technology, not just about technology, but topics that are passionate to themselves. I'm really pleased to have two guests with me today. I have Inga Thiessen and Asma Rawahi, and apologies for the pronunciation. I'll let Asma probably introduce that. And these two ladies are the co-founders of Hub in IT, an early stage startup for a B2B marketplace. And today we're just going to be listening and we're going to have an open conversation about their story, but also really get to grips about their views, women in tech from different geographies, different backgrounds. And we'll always finish on that all-important career advice for many of our listeners. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Asma and Inga. And maybe Asma, you can start by giving us a bit about your story.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on your podcast. Just to briefly introduce myself, Asma Rawahi. I'm based in Oman. I was born and raised here up to high school. And then I moved to the UK to complete my studies, where I did my bachelor's in marketing and my master's in entrepreneurship and innovation. So initially, I was actually meant to go into a different career field. I was meant to go into engineering, but unfortunately, I failed my A levels, and somehow I moved into marketing. So I think it was the right choice for me. You know, it was a different field, going to the business area, where I'm good at. But the thing that I noticed when I did marketing was there was that misconception that marketing is all about advertising or social media and so on. People never truly understood what marketing does. So after I completed that, I did some trainings, internships, and I was like, I need to expand and go dig deeper into something else. And I found entrepreneurship and innovation, which is something I found very interesting. Once I completed that, I got a lot of exposure into different innovations around the world during my studies. I've met different entrepreneurs, startups, and so on. And it was very eye-opening to see the different technologies that are available or that people are coming up with on the spot and so on. And that made me join an accelerator program or let's say a venture capital, where I spent about 6 months there helping them lead about 12 startups from just having an idea and simple operations into raising for funding and so on. And during that experience, I gained more insight into different business models, different innovations, different types of tech that just gets you thinking like, okay, what was that person's story that they had to come up with that idea? And I think mainly it was more of just opportunity. You know, you're in the right place at the right time. And after I completed that sort of period of my life, I decided to move into management consulting because I was like, okay, I kind of have an idea of where I want to be in the future, but I think I need that structural and like foundation in terms of a business environment, professional experience, and so on. So I spent about almost 3 years in management consulting. And then I started to, let's say, dip my feet back into the entrepreneurship and innovation world, where I think my passion always was. And I was like, okay, the structure is good, but that sense of, let's say, risk taking and doing something for yourself, the pros outweighed the cons, let's say. So that's just at a high level, my whole summary of what I've gone through in the past 5 to 6 years.
Fantastic. And thank you, Asma, because I know we're going to talk about it a bit later on, but it's so interesting to know from studying in Oman and then studying in the UK and actually having experience of startups, entrepreneurship, but also management consulting and back again. As I said, I know we'll cover it later, but you've probably seen all sorts, the different environments and what the challenges and opportunities are within. So yeah, we'll definitely come back to that. And so welcome Inga to the show.
Hi everyone. My name's Inga. I'm originally from Germany, but I studied in New York and in London, and I built most of my career in those two cities as well. So Before I got involved in tech and startups and entrepreneurship, I actually spent about 10 years in risk and crisis management. So I studied political science. I was on a very specific kind of career path and doing all of that. Most notably, before I ducked into startups, I was working in financial services on Canary Wharf. So very kind of traditional financial services life. And my story of getting into tech is completely coincidental. I fell into it. Like I said, I didn't study it. It wasn't something I thought about very actively, but an opportunity arose, and I thought, why not pivot and kind of change my life, do a bit of a career shift. Well, there's a change and take risk management. Spent
Inga, well,
yeah, connection's not great, is it?
We'll edit this bit, but do you want to start again
Okay.
just on the career change?
Yeah.
So just start again with the career change.
Okay, sure, that's fine. And just tell me again. I'm sorry, this is all I have. This is the connection I've got today, so I can't change it. But yeah, so I'm a career changer as well. I've done 10 years of a different life, so to speak. Feels like a different life. And I got into startups sort of by accident. A opportunity sort of presented itself. I thought, why not take the risk? Why not change it up? And I think looking back on it, what I realized that always attracted me to technology or startups is that you're building something, you're looking forward, it's futuristic without sounding too sci-fi. But having worked in financial services, I didn't, I never felt like we were kind of pushing the envelope on anything. It's not the new frontier. You're not building something really for the future, right? And so I think tech and startups give you that opportunity to really think forward, be hyper ambitious, and the need to get involved in also shaping the future, I think, is really important, which is something that I think Asma and I are both pretty passionate about, making sure that we've got diverse voices at the table. If you don't have the right, many voices present in shaping that future, it's compelled to kind of jump into the deep end of that pool and get my feet wet in that as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And again, it's also just such a lovely story, and where for yourself working and as we were saying before the podcast, in a traditional service, a traditional industry, a very well paid industry that you could have quite easily carried on your career within there and been very successful and carried on. But understandably, if that's not enough and that pushing that envelope to scratch that itch and that entrepreneurial spirit in you and say, you know what, I need to do this, and it doesn't matter whether you're a white male all the way through to whether you're someone from a total social economic background disadvantage. It's about having that confidence to try something and the support, I guess. And if we move that conversation onto this, thinking about you both taking that leap of faith, so you're obviously both. You've got that entrepreneurial part of you, otherwise you wouldn't have started your business, but you both also had worked for either management consulting or a large financial institution. Thinking about the challenges you've had being an entrepreneur and being a woman in entrepreneurial business, what were the challenges and anything that you've had to overcome that others could learn from?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Asma, if I start with you.
Okay, sure. I think from my experience, it would be more of I got into entrepreneurship, and specifically the current company that I'm in, or I've co-founded with Inga and the rest of the team, was all by accident. It was more of just networking, meeting the right people, and so on. And then the more I started getting into that, I realized, okay, this is something I want to do, but it's more about breaking those traditional norms that we have set. And I think in more of the Western areas, entrepreneurship and taking lead of your own career path and so on might be seen as, okay, it's becoming more culturally acceptable, let's say, and it's seen as a way of life. But if we think about it more from the Asian perspective, not just from Middle East, but also Asia, South Asia, and so on, there's still like certain culture barriers when it comes to that, because it's more of a family culture, it's more about, okay, you get a stable job. Once you get that stable job, you get married, you have kids, and, you build a family. It's not about, okay, succeeding and becoming the best version of yourself that you could be. And there are those ambitions. There are people that drive those type of, let's say, values and so on, but it's still as from a culture perspective, and there's still that sort of barrier. But in terms of the challenges, it was mainly for me, that wasn't a big challenge. Family are very supportive, they're like, okay, this is something you want, just go for it, but you got to show us the results in the end. But at the same time, I think the biggest barrier was the fact that I'm working with a team based in Netherlands, so it was that, okay, so one day you're going to move there, kind of question mark. That was the barrier, or how is it going to work? How long are you going to be there for? That kind of thing. And I think it all stems from the family culture that we have, and it's more of, this is your home, you should stay here. And and it may limit the growth of other entrepreneurs, because it stops them from thinking more international, more global, and seek those big opportunities rather than just building something that's sustainable in your country or in your region. You have to think global when you're starting a startup or wanting to go into entrepreneurship.
Yeah, what a fantastic point. And again, being able to relate to, or for you to be able to relate to the difference of Western culture, which has become a lot more embracing. And I think we've been led by America in that. I mean, I bet you've probably seen both sides, where America was probably the leaders in saying it's okay to fail. If you're an entrepreneur, most successful entrepreneurs have probably had 2 or 3 failed businesses behind them, and America embraces that. Whereas,
True.
And Inga, actually, that'd be a nice thing to move on to you to talk about that, because from the UK and the rest of Europe catching up, but then obviously Asia and Middle East is, as Asma said, probably not on that journey yet. Inga, how have you seen that journey unfold, being German, working in America and London?
Well, you're right. You're absolutely right to flag that. I kind of joke as it sometimes being a cowboy mentality, but I think entrepreneurship in America, especially out of Silicon Valley, kind of gets a lot of benefit of the doubt in that sense. You get to make lots of mistakes, and behind every successful startup, that same founder probably had previous failures, failed businesses. So you're right. There's definitely a lot more, freedom to trailblaze, even if you kind of go in the wrong direction for a while. And absolutely, in Europe, I found that the startup environment's a bit more conservative. For an IT, we're going to go for a funding round soon. And we've also already started thinking, investors here in Europe like to see a lot more security in their investment, meaning they already kind of want to see the business already functioning. It's harder to get that early stage investment, that seed investment, that pre-seed money, that angel money, those levels and those stages are much more difficult to get funded in Europe than they are in the US, because in the US there's more faith in you can make a few mistakes, so pick it back up. That risk taking is bigger, I think. And so we've already kind of had those conversations internally between Asma and the rest of the team, and we're already discussing that it's different. It's absolutely different in Europe. It's a slower scene. It's a bit harder in that sense. But it's just, have I that intersects, and people want to create startups. And even if it's a little harder to get that money, people get it, So I would say the landscape here in Europe is still very, very vibrant, very vibrant.
And
yeah,
because that's an interesting point when we think about, so there's two sides to this story, isn't there? There's one, geographies in terms of the mentality of investors and the cultural aspects of running a startup versus joining an established business. And then there's also the complexity of whether you're a female in tech and maybe, and Asma, without putting words in your mouth, where there's the focus is on building the family and stability, and therefore, having that stable job is pretty important. And versus and tell me if I'm right or wrong, is there more culturally, is it more acceptable for a male in Asia or Middle East to be a bit more of a risk taker, because they're fundamentally, it's not about them making the family, it's about providing for the family. Is that a fair assumption? Or
yeah, I think in terms from the male perspective, even though we've seen a rise in both female and women entrepreneurs in, let's say, the GCC region and Asia as well, but I think the biggest barrier was, as you mentioned, the family, regardless of whether male or female, because as you mentioned, male have to be the provider. So it's like, if you're willing to take a risk, you have a family that you have to provide for in the end of the day. So how can you take this risk? Who's going to put your children to school? Who's going to feed the table and so on? That sort of mentality. But I think from the female perspective is what we're seeing at the moment in the GCC is there's a rise of women entrepreneurs in the different industries when it comes to, let's say, fashion, beauty, or food. And that's because it's something that they can run as a home business. And then in the case that it takes off, then they start thinking of, okay, how can I start expanding this? But it's more of something just to do on the side, or once you retire, or you're just sick and tired of your current job. And it's like, all right, I'm just going to quit. Husband's going to pay the bills and I'm just going to do this on the side, But what's great to see now these days is we do have prominent women entrepreneurs, and even in the areas of technology, but I think there's still further growth to be made in those areas, So there's always areas for development, but it's good to see that it's rising at the moment.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, that there's it's rising, but it still can be improved. And I guess that's one of the fundamental things, is it's a journey. There's not a start or an end. It's got to become a way of life and normality. Inga, what do you think are the next significant steps the society or the tech industry need to do to continue that journey?
That's a really complicated, it's a very complex question. We could talk about a variety of structural issues. I think free daycare probably is a starting point, just kidding, but most women would probably agree. That's a complex one. But in general, I think one thing we could do is to not pat ourselves on the back so much. I think my humble impression, without being a sociologist who's actually studied this, I only have anecdotal evidence really, but my impression is that we sort of think we're actually doing pretty well. Women have got it pretty good, we've kind of done pretty good on the gender stuff. Mm-hmm. Gender's not so bad. There's women kind of everywhere in every business room. And so I think we think it's like, it's okay, it's on the right track. And perhaps, we're perhaps always getting better. But I think we underestimate how big that gender gap actually still is, especially in tech, and especially in entrepreneurship. It's probably got one of the largest gender gaps that you could ever envision. I think I saw a statistic from a few years ago, so forgive 2018-ish, but only 2% of VC funding in London goes to female founders. So 2%. So 98% goes to men, or heteronormative founders, because of course there's a whole other space of gender fluid and gender nonconforming people that aren't even being captured in the statistic. But let's just go from a bit of a binary perspective for a moment, just to highlight, wow, these are big gaps. I mean, I don't think we'd have any other field where we'd say 98% of doctors are men. I mean, I don't know if that's the case. I'd like to think not. 98% of solicitors in London are men. I'd like to think that's not the case. I'm presuming it's not a 98-to-2 ratio. So if we look at entrepreneurship, if we look at the tech space, it's pretty abysmal, actually. And I think it'd be shocking. I think most people in the West would be stunned by a figure like that. And I think if that's the future, and it's very kind of millennial and young, who are we leaving out of building the future then? So I think that would be sort of one of the first steps that I would encourage people to think about is, you know, how open are we really? How it's actually not as equal or egalitarian or as we think. I'm sort of lacking the words to kind of phrase it. But I think that would be the first thing I would flag for everyone to think about, is there's a lot of work to still be done on this front.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really, really poignant point, I think, actually, because what was lovely about that viewpoint, and especially that statistic, which I don't think is still too far out of date, to be honest. It's probably still, you know, quite relevant.
Even if it's gotten even if it's doubled, it's only 4%.
That's it.
Even if it's doubled,
But I know when we first met a couple of weeks ago when we were prepping for this podcast, and one of the things that I'm really passionate about is understanding that graduates studying STEM, in fact, at university level, the gender split is actually quite even. It fits between 60-40 when people are studying science, technology, engineering, or maths as a core subject at uni. Where the divide really comes from, what we see anyway academically, is when it comes to then looking at professions, for some reason, and this is what we've got to investigate, many females will go into studying science, medicine, or research, or science, or follow an academic route maybe, and they're more attracted to that, and we have to work out the reasons why. Whereas going down the engineering route and the tech route, that's where the real split happens, even though fundamentally the skill sets are transferable. You know, that's why, you know, if you've studied any of those subjects, the chances are you could become an amazing engineer as much as you could become an amazing scientist, because it's a lot of the same neuralistic skills that we use. Do either of you have a viewpoint on at that point, at the point of university and graduating, why that gap, that gender gap, starts happening as early as there?
I think so. I can speak to it from a slightly different angle. So having spent years in risk management, I've also spent years in security, in the security field for government, but also for the private sector. And that's a very kind of blokey, male-dominated industry. So I've oftentimes found myself to be the only woman in a room. And very similarly, we struggle to hire senior female leaders in the security space. We struggle to get applicants. We struggle to get those CV on the desks, to even review them, to even interview them, and then hopefully hire someone more diverse. It was like active females in, and perhaps you know, kind of recruitment, you types of roles, you just get one type of CV on your desk. You're looking.
We broke up
now.
Right?
That's fine.
No, we broke up. So what we got to is getting CVs onto the desk and then even interviewing them.
Exactly.
So maybe pick that up again from
sure, certainly. So we you know, struggled to even find those candidates, or rather they weren't coming to us. And I think perhaps it's a similar, it might have a similar complicated origin, which is this divide you're discussing, where I think because certain roles have been so male dominated, or so dominated by one type, it doesn't even only have to always be gender. is kind of obsessed with very bro-ish alpha people, very strong alphas. Everyone's an extrovert, and that's what we value. We value those who can present themselves loudly, and that's a leader. All that kind of rubbish, actually, at the end of the day. So even if you think of personality types, a lot of people don't see themselves in certain roles. They don't see themselves reflected in those roles, and so they won't apply for those roles. And so it can even be in the language of how a job is advertised. So we had job postings, and I remember one of my managers actually asked me to review it, and I flagged for him a lot of language that I thought was a bit actually a bit gendered, maybe, or could have created a thing where perhaps some female candidates would read that and think, oh, but that's not me. That, just even subconsciously felt excluded from the language of a job post. And so perhaps similarly, there's a disconnect between where women or where certain people and personality types, all these different, the beauty of the plethora of humans, right? Where I think certain people don't see themselves, they think that's not for me. And that could be socioeconomic background, it could be extroversion, which is always overrated. It could be gender, it's a variety of things. And so perhaps we're seeing that divergence for the same reason, that for whatever reason, the language and the image around those career paths just seem to feel exclusionary to certain groups.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that one. And Asma, what's your thoughts thinking about where that divide comes?
No, I agree with Inga as well. And I think if I speak from my experience in Oman, previously, the majority of jobs were very in the engineering sector, where like our economy is heavily invested into oil and gas. And that's where we get most of our income. So you can imagine the amount of oil and gas companies we have and so on. And most of their operations is what we call the field operations. So it's mainly in the desert. So it's a very intense environment where someone has to go post it out there for like 2 weeks or a month on end without coming back to the city and seeing their families and so on. And I think just that idea of that work environment might have put a divide already, because maybe males will be more inclined to take that job while females would like to stay at home and be with their families as well. But I think this kind of barrier started breaking up a bit, and recently there was an article posted where there has been more women engineers in Oman than men. So it was about like a 55% to 45%. I mean, don't hold me on the numbers.
Yeah.
But it was a great statistic, and to see that, okay, wow, we're really breaking forward now. And it's to show that the younger generation that like there's no job that's not for you. If you just have the skill set, the right mentality, you can do it. And don't let these barriers kind of come in the way and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think you're absolutely right. The two core topics here, one being around how jobs are being presented, and they can even, and this view that leadership is extroversion, and actually some of the most inspiring leaders are introverts, but it's understanding this, and secondly, to Asma's point about location and if you want to be an engineer for an oil and gas company in the old world, you might have had to locate there. What I'd love to think is with the last 18 months, the lessons we've learned around tech and the borderless world we now live in, where we can be, I mean, you guys have started a business and you're living in Oman and you're in the Netherlands, and yet you're able to be as fluid as if you're in the same room as each other. And hopefully that will be one of many things that can help diversity and to break these barriers. And again, Inga, on your point, something I see from my world of recruitment is, and again, don't quote me on the numbers, but there's a statistic that if in the old world, if a male saw a job spec and they were a 60% fit, they would apply for it. Whereas if a female looked at a job spec, if they weren't anything less than a 90% fit, they would turn it down. They wouldn't apply for it. And it's breaking those barriers of actually, you know, we should put ourselves out there, and that probably comes back to the entrepreneurship. You know, that we need to make it a culture where whether you're a man, woman, or anything in, you know, the whole spectrum, you should be given the chances and feel as empowered as a person sitting left or right to try new things. And it's quite inspiring to see that you two are doing that. You're leading, you're walking the walk, as they say, because you're breaking those barriers. So well done, you.
Thanks.
Yeah. So time has flown, and we've got to the part of the podcast now where for our listeners, that bit of career advice. So thinking about people about to enter that world, and that could be from high school all the way through to university, you know, what would be the one or two bits of advice you'd give someone when they're thinking about trying to get their first job? Maybe Asma, if we start with you.
I think for me, just speaking on my experience, when I kind of left university, I was still a bit not sure, or even high school, I wasn't sure of what do I really want to do. You know, I'm just like still a child, let's say, or a young adult. You know, all I'm thinking about is like, what am I going to do next weekend? So kind of like being put in that reality of, okay, so now I have to start thinking about what am I going to keep doing for the rest of my life. And the best advice I would give is try anything that comes your way, and don't be afraid to fail, and don't be afraid to ask like the dumb questions, because that's the only way you're going to learn. I've noticed a lot of young people like to say, I know, but sometimes it's good to say, no, I don't know, tell me. You know, you don't have to be an expert in your area just because you graduated in there. You know, do an internship, do a training, whether it's 2 months here, 3 months there, and so on, till you kind of find the right path for you. It's all just trial and error, I think. You know, everyone just tries a different thing, or you just find something that you think you're kind of good at and stick with that for the rest of your life. But it's more of just like, you know, building yourself up, building the confidence up that you can say, okay, this is what I want to do, and this is where I want to move into.
Yeah. Fantastic. And thank you, Asma. And Inga, your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. I would just second that fully. Yeah, try everything. Don't feel boxed in. Don't think this isn't for me. If there's anything about a role, a sector that looks interesting, but you think I didn't study it, just go for it and try as much as you can, especially in your 20s. That would definitely be something to help next. So it's never a wasted opportunity. I'm in a completely different place professionally than I thought I would have been. I thought I was going to do international development or I don't know what. But it's funny, I guess I'm looking at building the future in a different way than I thought, having done political science. So exactly like Asma said, it's all for you. Like the world is really your oyster. Any of the roles will suit you, introvert or extrovert, or, you know, communicative or not. It's try it all. And just, don't be afraid. Take those risks, especially, again, like I said, sort of younger. I wish I had done startups earlier. I wish I had gotten into startups in my 20s. It's a great learning opportunity. It's a really big, it can be a big career jump for yourself in your own mind. And so I would encourage younger graduates to try ambiguous roles, startups. It's a good one.
Yeah. Well, and again, I agree with you both, and I think you both just articulated that brilliantly. It's have a try and be fearless and go for it. So, wow. Well, thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
That's another episode of our Future Tech podcast. So, for everybody listening, I hope you enjoyed this one. As I said, I was really looking forward to this episode, as it's been really quite a unique look, and to have both Inga and Asma on the show to give their viewpoints. It'll be brilliant. So to all our listeners, the podcast is now on 35 university career portals and our Spotify channel. And of course, it will be posted on our LinkedIn channel weekly. So this episode will be airing around October time for anyone who, late October. And a big thank you to Asma and Inga. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you for listening to Future Tech with Charlie Sell, a podcast from Arrows Group Global. Please subscribe to this podcast so that you never miss an episode. Arrows Group is a global technology recruitment and workforce solutions provider who focus on people at the heart of all our interactions. With in-depth technology expertise and global candidate communities, we offer bespoke solutions to every client and candidate. To find out more, visit arrowsgroup.com.